Okay, let's unpack this. We've been handed a significant stack of sources articles, historical analyses, theological treatises detailing dozens of deep, complex, and sometimes explosive critiques aimed at the conduct of Prophet Muhammad.
Yeah, it's a huge topic.
It really is. It covers everything from his personal life and marriages to rules of warfare and penal law.
And it's an immense intellectual challenge. So I think it's important to state our mission today. We're explicitly not here to judge the critiques themselves.
No, not at all.
Our mission is to analyze the scholarly responses to them. We need to map out the intellectual landscape by distinguishing between how, say, classical pre-modern Muslim scholars defended these actions.
And how modern Muslim academics and apologists recontextualize or, reinterpret them today.
Exactly. We're deep diving into the defenses.
And what's immediately clear from the sources is that across all these topics, from marriage to war, there are really three core intellectual pillars that keep showing up.
They absolutely do. The first one is contextualization. This is the foundational argument. Basically, judging actions strictly by 7th century Arabian norms and the state of society globally at the time, not by our 21st century values. It's the anti-anachronism defense.
Makes sense. What's the second pillar?
Second is source criticism. This is vital, especially in the modern era. Scholars rigorously evaluate the authenticity or the strength of specific narrations, the hadith.
So they're asking, did this controversial event even happen the way it's recorded? Or has it been exaggerated?
Precisely. And the third pillar, which often overlaps with the first, is the theological purpose.
The why.
The why. This defense asserts that certain actions, even if they appear harsh or like exceptions to general rules, were necessary. They were legislative or political acts required for establishing a brand new legal and social order.
Okay, let's use that framework then and start with the personal sphere. This is where you see some of the most visible friction with modern ethics, marriage, age, and domestic law.
And the most historically persistent question involves the marriage to Aisha.
The reported age of consummation, often cited as 9 years old.
This is a perfect demonstration of that classical versus modern divide in defense. The classical scholars, they affirmed the age of 9. They based it on authentic, strong hadith from collections like Bukhari and Muslim.
So they didn't dispute the number?
No, their defense was purely contextual. They argued that puberty, not chronological age, defined adulthood and marriage readiness in that era. And this wasn't just in Arabia, it was common across Byzantine, Persian, and even Jewish societies of the time.
A key point they make is that his contemporary critics never raised this as an issue.
Exactly. So the classical view essentially says the text is strong and the context validated the practice. But the modern defense, faced with modern notions of consent, it splits into two very different intellectual paths.
What's the first path?
Path one is what you could call revisionist chronology. So using genealogical data like calculating the age of Aisha's older sister, as must some modern scholars argue that, based on a strict timeline, Aisha was actually closer to 18 or 19 at consummation.
So they're directly challenging the 9-year reports as erroneous.
Yes, or miscalculations of historical age references.
That's a huge challenge to centuries of textual consensus. What about the second modern path?
The second path is more about moral relativism and functional contextualism. They might accept the younger age, but argue that our modern Western construction of childhood simply did not exist then.
Okay.
And critically, they shift the focus. They emphasize Aisha's later role as a powerful, politically active, and leading scholar, a source of religious law. They frame her not as a child bride in the modern sense, but as a foundational matriarch and a key intellectual figure.
That's a sophisticated defense. Arguing her profound historical significance outweighs the contemporary ethical discomfort. Okay, let's move on to polygamy. The critique is that Muhammad had 11 or more wives when later Muslims were restricted to 4.
Right, and the defense here leans heavily on that theological purpose pillar. Scholars argue the 4-wife limit was revealed after most of his later marriages were already in place.
So it wasn't retroactive?
No. And they detail that he had a special dispensation, it's outlined in the Quran, which was deemed necessary for the public interest.
Public interest how?
Well, for cementing crucial political alliances, uniting disparate tribes, and providing welfare for the widows of his companions who were killed in these existential battles. It was a functional political necessity for that specific historical moment.
That brings us directly to the marriage that most confuses outsiders. The marriage to Zainab, his adopted son's ex-wife. The critique often suggests personal desire motivated this.
And what's fascinating here is how scholars frame this as an act of critical legal reform. The marriage was explicitly ordained by revelation to abolish a deeply entrenched pre-Islamic taboo,
Which taboo was that?
the one that treated adopted sons exactly like biological sons. This marriage was a necessary reform to establish clear rules on lineage, inheritance, and marriage eligibility in the new legal order.
So the marriage itself was a deliberate, visible, living demonstration, almost an abolitionist statement to legally destroy that social norm.
Precisely. Scholars argue that the revelation actually challenged Muhammad himself. He initially hesitated because of the expected social stigma, rather than simply indulging him. The purpose was to make an undeniable legislative statement.
Okay, let's transition into the legal sphere, which deals with some really contentious issues like slavery and captivity. The critique is simple and direct. Muhammad owned and participated in transactions involving slaves.
And we have to situate this in the 7th century context, where slavery was a universal, inherited economic and social system across the known world. The classical defense doesn't deny the practice.
It can't.
Right. It pivots entirely to Islam's regulatory framework. They argue Islam regulated the system by mandating humane treatment, establishing defined rights for the enslaved, and most importantly, actively creating legal avenues for freedom.
Tell us more about those legal avenues, because that's where the mechanism of reform becomes clear. How did Islam structure the system to push toward manumission?
There are two key mechanisms the sources emphasize. First is manumission as expiation, or kafara.
So paying for a sin by freeing someone.
Exactly. Islam essentially monetized sin toward freedom. Many sins like breaking an oath or accidental homicide required freeing a slave as mandatory atonement. This systematically injected a demand for manumission right into the legal structure.
And the second one?
The second was mukataba. This was a legal contract where a slave could buy their own freedom over time, and masters were actually obliged to assist them financially in doing so.
So the intellectual defense is that Islam didn't just wave a magic wand and abolish a global economic system overnight.
No.
It constructed a legal framework that made freeing slaves a virtuous, legally mandated, and financially incentivized act. That definitely shifts the narrative from pure endorsement to systematic reduction.
And that systematic reduction is the central point of the modern defense. Modern scholars argue that Islam aimed at gradual abolition. They see these regulations, kafara, mukataba, mandatory humane treatment, as necessary intermediate steps.
Not an endorsement of slavery in perpetuity.
Not at all. And they emphasize that Muhammad personally freed dozens of individuals, like Seed and Bilal.
This systematic reduction leads directly to the critique regarding concubinage and female captives, sexual relations with what your right hands possess, like Maria the Copt or Rahana.
Again, the defense views this as regulation aimed at protection, not pure endorsement. In antiquity, war captives had virtually no rights. They faced terrible fates. Integrating them into households granted them protection, established paternity for their children, and elevated their status legally within that historical context.
And what was the significance of the status of someone like Maria the Copt who bore his son Ibrahim?
She attained the elevated status of Walad, which literally means mother of a child.
And that came with legal protections.
A huge legal safety net. Under this status, she was automatically freed upon her master's death, and her children were born free. This provided far more security and dignity than they would have had as unprotected captives in the 7th century.
That certainly sounds like an improvement on the norms of the era. But it's crucial to confirm, contemporary scholars do not advocate for reviving this practice today.
Absolutely correct. While defending the historical regulation as an improvement over the era's norms, modern scholars categorically reject the revival or re-implementation of concubinage today.
And why is that?
They cite changed global norms and, crucially, the overriding objective, the maqasid of Islamic law, which is fundamentally focused on human dignity and justice.
Let's shift now to the political sphere. Warfare, treason, and justice. The first critique is about the early caravan raids, often viewed through a modern lens as, well, banditry.
The scholarly defense here is purely contextualization and lawful retaliation. They reframe these as acts of economic warfare. The Quraysh tribe had first confiscated the entire property and wealth of the Muslims when they forced them into exile.
So this wasn't random robbery.
No, scholars view the raids as seizing enemy assets during a declared state of conflict to recoup stolen wealth. It's essentially a lawful taking of enemy capital during a state of war, comparable to wartime sanctions.
Here's where the historical record gets particularly complex. The mass execution of the Jewish tribe Banu Qurayza after the Battle of the Trench. The critique focuses on the sheer number 600 to 900 men and the perceived severity.
The classical defense rests on the political context and the judicial process. 1. The tribe committed high treason by secretly aligning with invading forces during the siege, an action that threatened to annihilate the entire Muslim community.
It was an existential threat.
Absolutely. 2. The judgment wasn't Muhammad's decree. It was handed down by Sa'ud ibn Mu'ad, the tribe's own chosen arbitrator and a former ally.
And the third point.
3. Sa'ud applied a law comparable to ancient wartime law, specifically the law of war found in Deuteronomy, and only the pubescent fighting males were executed.
Wow, so they're defending the severity of the act based on wartime necessity and due process. But modern scholarship adds a critical layer to this, right? They question the historical data itself.
Yes, this is where source criticism enters. Modern historians, notably W.N. Arafat, have disputed those high numbers, 600 and 900, found in early accounts like Ibn Ishaq.
On what grounds?
They argue the figures are historically exaggerated due to weak transmission chains and the common, narrative hyperbole of early histories. Suggesting the real number was much lower is a key modern defense strategy.
That tension between defending the necessity of the act while also questioning the reliability of the number is fascinating. We also have critiques about the ordered assassinations of poets and critics like Ka'b bin al-Ashraf. Was this suppression of dissent?
The scholarly defense strictly distinguishes between peaceful criticism and existential military threat. They argue these individuals were targeted not for writing poetry,
but for something more.
Much more. For active treason, espionage, and clear incitement to violence in the context of existential warfare. Ka'b, for instance, was reportedly organizing and recruiting armies against Medina.
And I believe there's also source criticism applied here too.
There is. Scholars often reject the hadith concerning the poetess Asma bint Marwan as weak or fabricated, basically shifting the burden of proof.
That contextualization is key. Okay, let's move to the penal sphere. This is where we see conflict between traditional laws and modern ethical concepts of human rights. Let's start with apostasy and freedom of belief.
The tension here is stark. It pits a historical punishment against a Quranic principle. The classical view saw apostasy in a nascent Islamic state as equivalent to political treason.
Like desertion in wartime.
Exactly. Leaving the community was often tantamount to joining the enemy, so it was punishable by death.
But this clashes directly with the Quran's most famous declaration on belief. There is no compulsion in religion.
It does. And this is the intellectual lever for the modern reformist view. Contemporary scholars argue that there should be no death penalty for belief change alone. They rely heavily on that Quranic verse.
So how do they explain the historical punishment?
They argue it only applied to rebels who actively threaten the state or join a military enemy, not to private changes of conscience. The overriding principle of religious freedom must prevail.
Next, the controversy over Quran 4.34, which critics cite as permitting men to beat disobedient wives, a clear contradiction of modern notions of equality and safety.
The defense here is critically two-pronged. First, and most importantly, the prophetic example. The prophet never struck any of his wives or any servant in his life.
So that sets the highest nonviolent ethical standard.
It does. Then you have to reconcile the text itself. The classical interpretation tried to mitigate the verse. They insisted that the word daraba, to strike, must be interpreted as symbolic, extremely light, or non-harmful.
Like a tap with a small twig, I've read.
Yes, something like that. And only as an absolutely last resort after prior steps like admonition and temporary separation have failed.
But the modern interpretation goes even further, correct?
It does. Modern scholars will argue that daraba should be translated not as beat, but as separate or go away. They insist any interpretation that permits domestic violence is categorically forbidden.
No, why?
Because it violates the overarching objectives, the maqasid, of Islamic law concerning the sanctity of the family and human dignity. They prioritize the Prophet's nonviolent example over a literal, harmful reading of the text.
Finally, we address the defense of harsh punishments, hudud-like amputation or stoning. Why did classical scholars defend laws that seem so incompatible with modern human rights?
Classical scholars saw these punishments primarily as deterrents in a pre-modern society that had no functional prisons. But, and this is the critical point, they were applied only under extremely stringent evidentiary standards.
For example?
Well, to punish adultery by stoning requires 4 direct, impeccable eyewitnesses to the act itself. This makes conviction virtually impossible without a voluntary repeated confession.
So the argument is that these were symbolic deterrents, meant to discourage crime through fear of the law, rather than laws meant for regular implementation.
Exactly. And that leads to the modern legal view. Contemporary scholars argue that such punishments can and should be suspended or replaced today via that principle of maqasid al-sharia.
Let's pause there and clarify that key technical term for you. What exactly is maqasid al-sharia?
The maqasid are the higher overriding objectives or goals of the law. Things like preserving life, preserving reason, preserving religion, preserving property.
So how does that apply to these punishments?
Modern scholars argue that if a historical punishment like amputation no longer achieves deterrence effectively, or if it conflicts with the higher goal of preserving human dignity, then legal discretion, or ijtihad, must be used to replace it with a contemporary punishment that better serves those overarching objectives.
That gives a clear mechanism for how a modern Muslim state could adhere to the principles of justice while dispensing with the historical mechanics. Okay, last segment. The nature of revelation itself. Critics argue that Muhammad invented convenient revelations for his own household rules, for example, or was subject to error, citing the infamous satanic verses incident.
Right, the satanic verses story. It's crucial to address. It is almost universally rejected by majority Muslim scholarship, both classical and modern. They view it as a fabrication with weak and untrustworthy transmission chains.
And it contradicts a core belief.
It contradicts the fundamental Quranic promise of divine protection for the revelation.
And what about the argument that some revelations were just suspiciously convenient for him personally?
Scholars counter that by pointing out that many revelations did the opposite of convenience. They restricted, or sometimes even scolded, Muhammad himself.
Can you give an example?
Sure. They point to Surah Abasa, where he is reprimanded for turning away from a blind man, or verses that imposed stricter moral limits on his divorce and future marriage options. The counter-argument is clear. If he were authoring the text, why would he include verses that criticize his own conduct or limit his choices?
That suggests the source was indeed external and authoritative.
That's the argument.
And that really drives home the final scholarly position. If Muhammad is viewed as the ultimate moral example, why do his historical actions sometimes conflict so fundamentally with 21st century values on consent and equality?
This is where the defense rests most heavily on the need to reject anachronism. Moral standards are relative across time. Scholars argue Muhammad was fundamentally an ethical reformer for his time.
Ending brutal practices like female infanticide.
Exactly. And vastly improving women's rights and legal standing relative to 7th century Arabia. His actions have to be measured against the society he was reforming.
So, if the historical mechanics are controversial today, what does a modern Muslim intellectual tradition demand of its followers?
The final scholarly position is that Muslims today must emulate the enduring principles of his life: justice, mercy, profound honesty, social reform, while proactively utilizing legal discretion, ijtihad, to adapt the historical mechanics to fit contemporary ethical and legal frameworks that uphold those higher objectives of human dignity.
The principle is eternal. The application is temporary.
Well said.
That brings us to our key takeaways. After dissecting these defenses across the personal, legal, and political spheres, what stands out as the ultimate distinction between these two scholarly streams?
For me, it's the clear demarcation. The classical stream focuses on textual affirmation and strict 7th century context, essentially saying it was right because it was the norm and the text validated it.
And the modern stream?
The modern stream is far more critical. It uses filtration of sources, it looks for a trajectory toward gradual reform, and most importantly, it aligns contemporary practice with those higher ethical objectives, the maqasid, of Islamic law. It's a constant, vibrant, internal discourse.
This analysis of the sources shows us that the intellectual tradition is not static. It's constantly engaging with the tension between historical practice and timeless moral goals. And for you, the listener, this deep dive raises this essential, overarching question applicable to any historical moral exemplar. When evaluating any figure from the distant past, how do we intellectually distinguish between an eternal moral principle, like the necessity of justice or mercy, and a temporary historical application that was only relevant to the immediate political and social mechanics of its time? That is something worth mulling over.